The wind that swept across the northern mountains carried more than snow. It carried a name, Valoria. At first, it was spoken quietly in taverns and border camps, dismissed as another rebel group that would fade with winter. But this rumor did not fade. It returned with every messenger, every wounded soldier, every shattered banner brought back from the north. The southern kingdom of Aranthor had not expected resistance. They had expected fear. They had expected surrender. Instead, their trained soldiers were outmaneuvered in narrow mountain, passes by a force that should not have survived a single charge. And that was what disturbed them most. The survivors did not speak of numbers. They spoke of discipline. They spoke of formation shifts that came too quickly to counter, of traps placed with foresight, of a commander who never panicked, never rushed, never wasted men. They spoke of a leader who fought like he had already seen the future. When the reports reached Lord Caelthorn in his capital, he did not throw the parchment in rage. He read every word carefully twice. A rebellion could be crushed. Bandits could be hunted. But strategy was dangerous. His generals tried to dismiss it. A mountain skirmish, one said. Weather advantage, said another. Luck, suggested a third. Caelthorn silenced them with a single look. Luck does not organize retreats. Luck does not rotate exhausted units. Luck does not anticipate flanking routes in terrain it barely knows. Something had changed in the north, and the most unsettling detail was repeated in every account. The commander was young, too young. Aelor of Valoria. The name sounded insignificant when spoken aloud, yet Caelthorn felt the weight behind it. History had taught him that empires rarely begin with armies. They begin with ideas, and ideas led by the young were the most dangerous of all. Meanwhile, beyond forests and silver rivers, word of Valoria reached the eastern kingdom of Elindra. Their queen, Seraphine, listened differently. Where Aranthor heard insult, she heard opportunity. A northern force built not on greed, but survival. Fighters who defended their own people, not hired blades chasing coin. A leader who inspired loyalty without crowns or bloodlines. Such movements were rare, and rare things were valuable. Seraphine understood power better than most rulers. Power was not only steel and soldiers. It was influence, alignment, timing. If Valoria was allowed to grow unchecked, it might become uncontrollable. But if guided, supported, subtly shaped, it could become a powerful ally on her board. While Aranthor sharpened swords, Elindra sharpened patience. And in the mountains, unaware of how far their name had traveled, Valoria continued to build. The valley that once sheltered frightened. Survivors now echoed, with hammers striking stone. Watchtowers rose slowly along the cliffs. Rotations were established for patrol. Supplies were rationed with precision. Training drills ran daily, even in freezing wind. This was no longer desperation. This was structure. Aelor walked through the growing settlement without ceremony. He listened more than he spoke. He observed weaknesses before praising strengths. He studied the terrain like it was a living ally. He knew something the others did not yet feel. Victory draws attention, and attention invites response. The northern sky seemed peaceful, but Aelor sensed the shift. The world beyond the mountains had noticed them, and kingdoms do not ignore rising powers near their borders. In distant capitals, maps were being marked. In council chambers, strategies were forming. And somewhere in the south, pride had been wounded. Wounded pride is more dangerous than open hatred. Valoria had survived its first test. Now it had entered something far more complex. Politics. And politics was a battlefield without clear lines. The wind blew harder that night, sweeping across the watchtowers and newly raised crimson banners. The symbol of Valoria fluttered defiantly against the dark sky. They had wanted only to survive, but survival had turned into identity. Identity had turned into unity, and unity had turned into threat. Far away, in a chamber lit by golden torches, Lord Caelthorn finally gave a quiet order to his closest advisor. Watch them. Study them. And when the time comes, his eyes darkened. We do not fight to win. We fight to erase. The game had begun, and Valoria did not yet know how many players were moving pieces against it. The valley no longer sounded like a refuge. It sounded like construction, stone cracked beneath iron tools. Timber was dragged across frozen ground. Smoke rose from newly built forges where metal was shaped into something stronger than survival, into permanence. Valoria was changing. What began as a desperate sanctuary in the mountains was becoming something structured, planned, intentional. Aelor had ordered the first true expansion beyond the original camp. Not recklessly, not emotionally, but strategically. The valley had limits. If Valoria was to endure, it needed food security, defensive depth, and trade routes. Hiding behind stone would only delay the inevitable. Expansion was not ambition, it was necessity. Small scouting units were sent to nearby plateaus and forest edges, not to conquer, but to observe. They mapped water sources, fertile soil, narrow passes that could be fortified. Every hill, every slope, every shadow was studied. Valoria would not grow blindly. It would grow intelligently. Refugees continued to arrive. They did not come because of promises. They came because of stories. Stories of a leader who fought beside his soldiers, of fair rations, of protection without cruelty, of discipline without tyranny. A blacksmith from the west arrived with his 2 daughters, carrying nothing but tools wrapped in cloth. A former guard captain from a fallen town pledged his blade not for gold, but for purpose. Farmers offered seeds saved from burned villages. Each arrival strengthened more than numbers. It strengthened belief. With growth came strain. Food supplies tightened. Tensions rose between original survivors and newcomers. Some feared infiltration. Others feared overextension. Aelor felt it all. Leadership was no longer about battlefield decisions. It was about balance. One evening, he stood overlooking the expanding settlement, where there had once been scattered tents. Wooden foundations now marked planned streets. Watchtowers rose at calculated intervals. Training grounds were clearly defined. This was no longer chaos held together by hope. This was order built through will. Yet Aelor did not celebrate. Because growth creates visibility, and visibility invites danger. He called a council beneath the central banner. Veterans, craftsmen, scouts, voices from every part of Valoria. Not because he doubted himself, but because unity must be maintained through inclusion. "We are becoming stronger," one council member said proudly. "Yes," Aelor replied calmly, "and strength attracts pressure." He spoke of food reserves, of winter projections, of defensive perimeters expanding in rings rather than lines. He outlined how each new settlement outside the valley would function not as isolated farms, but as connected nodes. If attacked, they would not collapse individually. They would reinforce each other. Valoria would expand like a shield, not a spear. Controlled, measured, unbreakable. The first outer settlement was established 3 miles east, near a river bend rich with soil. It was modest, wooden palisades, a watchpost, grain storage. But symbolically, it meant everything. Valoria had stepped beyond its birthplace. For the first time, they were not merely surviving within the mountains. They were shaping them. News of this expansion traveled faster than they expected. Caravans passing distant roads heard of a structured northern force building actual infrastructure. Traders whispered of stability in lands once considered lawless. And stability is attractive in a chaotic world, but so is dominance. As the second settlement began construction, Aelor received reports from scouts. Southern patrols had increased along border territories. They were watching, testing, measuring response times. Valoria was no longer an unknown rumor. It was being evaluated. That night, Aelor walked alone through the training grounds. Soldiers moved in synchronized drills beneath torchlight, shields locked. Commands echoed in disciplined rhythm. Months ago, these were frightened civilians. Now they moved like an army, not the largest, not the most equipped, but unified. And unity is a force kingdoms often underestimate. Aelor stopped at the edge of the eastern watchtower. From there, he could see the faint outline of the new settlements, fires glowing in the distance. Expansion had begun. There would be no return to obscurity now. He understood the truth more clearly than anyone. Growth is a declaration, and declarations are answered. Far beyond the mountains, messengers were already riding south and east. Reports were being rewritten. Valoria was no longer described as a rebellion. It was described as emerging power, and emerging powers do not remain small for long. The mountains had given them shelter. Now Valoria was beginning to claim them. Expansion changed everything. With the second settlement nearly complete, Valoria no longer looked like a hidden resistance. It looked organized, intentional, permanent, and permanence makes rulers uncomfortable. The eastern road into the mountains had always been quiet, too difficult for trade, too narrow for armies. But one cold afternoon, watchmen spotted movement along the lower pass. Not soldiers, not raiders, a formal procession. Silver banners shimmered even beneath grey skies. Horses wore polished armor. At their center rode a woman clad in silver-blue silk and steel, not a warrior, yet not defenseless. Envoys from Elindra. They entered beneath raised crimson flags, escorted but not disarmed. Aelor received them in the central courtyard, where stone foundations were still being laid. Dust clung to boots. Hammers echoed in the distance. Valoria did not pretend to be more than it was. The Elindran envoy spoke smoothly. Her Majesty Queen, Seraphine of Elindra sends respect to the rising strength of Valoria. The words were carefully chosen. Not rebellion, not settlement. Strength. Recognition is power. Aelor listened without interruption. The envoy continued. The Eastern Kingdom values stability in these mountains. We offer trade routes, steel shipments, grain support during winter, and formal recognition of Valoria as a sovereign territory. A murmur spread through Aelor's council. Recognition meant legitimacy. Legitimacy meant protection. But offers from kingdoms are never gifts. And in return, Aelor asked calmly. The envoy's eyes did not waver. Military alignment, shared intelligence, mutual defense agreements, mutual defense, or shared wars. The silence stretched. Aelor studied the envoy, not her posture, not her tone, but the intention behind her words. Elindra was clever. They did not threaten. They did not demand submission. They offered partnership, but partnerships between unequal powers often become dependency. If Valoria accepted steel and grain too soon, it might never stand independently. Yet rejecting Elindra outright could push them into enemy territory. That night, Aelor convened his council. Some urged acceptance. With Elindra's support, Aranthor would hesitate. Recognition protects us from isolation. Others warned caution. If we bind ourselves now, we fight their wars. We become a tool, not an empire. Aelor remained silent for long minutes. Leadership was no longer about battlefield tactics. It was about long-term consequence. Finally he spoke. We will respond with respect, but we will not accept aid we cannot repay. Valoria would propose limited trade, resources exchange for resources. No military oath, no political chain. An alliance built slowly or not at all, because independence was the foundation of their identity. What Aelor did not know was that while diplomacy unfolded in daylight, darkness had already begun moving. In the southern capital of Aranthor, Lord Kael'thorn received new intelligence. Elindra approaches them, his advisor reported. Kael'thorn's jaw tightened. So the Eastern Queen sees value in my humiliation. He walked toward a large map carved into his war table. Valoria's location had been marked again, no longer small. Growing. Kael'thorn understood something dangerous was forming. If Elindra and Valoria aligned, the North would stabilize under new leadership. Trade routes would shift, influence would shift, power would shift, and Kael'thorn did not tolerate shifts. He did not prepare an army. Not yet. Open war could unite Valoria further. Instead, he chose precision. He summoned men who did not wear uniforms, mercenaries, professionals, loyal to coin and contract. Their leader, a scarred veteran known only as Varin, stood before him without bowing. I do not fight rebellions, Varin said plainly. This is not rebellion, Kael'thorn replied. This is prevention. The contract was simple. Infiltrate. Observe. Remove the leader. No banners. No declarations. No survivors who could trace it back. Cut off the head, Kael'thorn said quietly, and the body collapses. Varin accepted. Gold changes loyalties faster than ideology. Days later, under a moonless sky, shadows moved through the lower forests. They did not march in formation. They did not light torches. They studied patrol patterns, counted guard rotations, noted watchtower blind spots. Valoria was disciplined, but discipline can be mapped. Snow began falling lightly, covering tracks almost as quickly as they were made. The mercenaries waited for the perfect night. Patience is the weapon of professionals. Inside the valley, Aelor felt something shift. Not fear, not certainty, but instinct. He ordered patrol rotations altered without explanation. He doubled watch on the eastern ridge. He walked the perimeter himself. Growth had made Valoria visible. Visibility invites predators, and predators rarely announce themselves. Far beyond the watchfires, Varin studied the valley from a shadowed cliff. He did not underestimate what he saw. Structured defenses, coordinated patrols, leadership that had learned quickly. He smiled faintly. "Good," he whispered. "A worthy contract." The wind howled through the mountains. Beneath its sound, something else moved. Not an army, not yet, but a blade in the dark. Valoria had chosen independence. Now independence would be tested. The snow fell heavier that night. Thick.
Quiet.
Deceptive. It muffled footsteps. Swallowed sound. Turned the valley into a white grave waiting to be claimed. The first guard never screamed. He barely had time to register movement behind him before steel slipped between the joints of his armor. His body was lowered gently into the snow. Professional. Efficient. Varin's mercenaries moved like ghosts through the outer perimeter. They did not rush. They waited for patrol gaps. They timed the wind to hide the sound of boots. Valoria had grown strong, but strength still has seams. Inside the settlement, fires burned low. Soldiers rotated shifts. Workers slept after long days building stone foundations. Aelor was awake. He had not removed his armor fully, a habit he had developed since expansion began. Something in the air felt wrong. Not danger he could see, but danger that watched. Then it happened. A single horn blast tore through the night. Short. Cut off. The signal of breach. The valley erupted. Torches flared. Soldiers scrambled into formation. Commands echoed through the snow-covered streets, and from the shadows, the mercenaries struck. Not wildly, precisely. They targeted command runners first, then watch captains. They created confusion, not chaos, isolating sections of the defense. Varin's objective was not massacre. It was one life. Aelor. Steel clashed near the eastern corridor as mercenaries, cut through a secondary gate. Valorian soldiers responded quickly, shields locking, spears braced. Months ago, such an infiltration would have shattered them. But Valoria had changed. Drills turned into instinct. Instinct turned into discipline. Aelor reached the central square just as a mercenary unit pushed through the inner ring. Snow swirled violently between torchlight and shadows. For the first time, he saw them clearly. Not raiders, not desperate soldiers, killers. Their movements were controlled, economical, designed for assassination. Aelor stepped forward without hesitation. "Hold formation," he commanded. Shields locked tighter. The first mercenary charge hit like a hammer. But Valoria did not break. The formation absorbed the impact, spears thrusting through narrow openings. Aelor fought at the front, not recklessly, but deliberately. His blade moved with precision learned from necessity, not arrogance. He adapted quickly, reading their rhythm. Varin observed from the rear. He watched Aelor command mid-combat, shifting positions, reinforcing weak points before they collapsed. This was no lucky mountain leader. This was a strategist under pressure. The battle tightened into brutal close quarters. Snow turned red beneath boots. Torches fell and hissed against ice. Then Varin moved. Fast. Direct. He cut through two defenders and lunged toward Aelor. Steel met steel. The clash rang sharper than the others. Aelor felt immediately this was the leader. Varin fought without wasted motion. No anger, no pride, just execution. They exchanged strikes that tested more than strength. Varin aimed not for dramatic blows, but for small openings. A joint, a shoulder seam, a gap near the ribs. Aelor adjusted. He retreated half a step, not from fear, but to pull Varin slightly deeper into Valorian territory. A signal passed silently. Two shield-bearers shifted. A spear thrust from Varin's blind angle, forcing him to pivot. In that fraction of hesitation, Aelor countered, disarming Varin's primary blade with a sharp rotational strike. Varin staggered back, assessing. This was no easy contract. The horn sounded again, this time from the western ridge. Valorian reinforcements had sealed the outer exit. The mercenaries were trapped inside the valley they had infiltrated. Varen made a decision. He whistled sharply, a retreat signal. Professional killers know when a contract becomes suicide. Under coordinated cover, the remaining mercenaries disengaged, disappearing back into forest shadows almost as swiftly as they came. The snow continued falling. Silence slowly replaced steel. Valoria stood, breathing hard, wounded, but unbroken. Aelor watched the tree line long after the last shadow vanished. "They weren't testing us," one soldier muttered. "They were hunting." Aelor nodded slightly. "Yes." The bodies in the snow proved something undeniable. This was not random aggression. This was calculated elimination. And it meant one thing. A kingdom had chosen to remove him quietly. At dawn, the council gathered. Casualties were reported. Defensive flaws identified. Patrol rotations re-evaluated, but the deeper wound was not physical. It was political. Valoria was no longer ignored. It was targeted. Aelor stood before the crimson banner as sunlight broke through clouds. "We built to survive," he said evenly. "We trained to defend." His eyes hardened. "Now we prepare to deter." He understood the lesson. Hiding strength invites attack. Displaying strength prevents it. Valoria could no longer remain reactive. If southern forces believed they could strike unseen, then Valoria must show them the cost of underestimation. Scouts would move beyond the mountains. Intelligence networks would expand. Fortifications would double. And most importantly, Valoria would send a message, not of revenge, of warning. That same morning, Aelor issued a quiet order. Identify who sent them, not to retaliate blindly, but to understand the board, because wars are not won by anger. They are won by awareness. Far in the south, Varen returned alone to Kael'thorne's chamber. He did not kneel. "They are disciplined," Varen said bluntly. "The leader is capable." Kael'thorne's eyes darkened. "Capable men can still fall." Varen shook his head slightly. "Not easily." For the first time, Kael'thorne felt it. Valoria was no longer a spark. It was structure, and structure is far harder to extinguish. Back in the mountains, Aelor looked over the valley, over the watchtowers, the settlements, the people who now depended on his decisions. The world had drawn a line in the snow. Valoria would not retreat behind it. It would step forward. "They came for our leader in the dark. Next time, we meet them in the light."